What would you do if you woke up one day, trapped in a secret prison, with no idea how you got there? And even worse, what if the reason you were locked away was far more terrifying than you could ever imagine? Stay with me. This woman's story will send chills down your spine. Meet Emily, a woman with a life that seemed like a dream. Perfect job, loving family, and a future full of possibilities. But one day, she vanished without a trace. No one knew where she went or why. Her family searched for years, desperate for answers. The police hit dead ends, and hope faded as the years slipped by. But after 10 long years, Emily was found, rescued from a secret prison. And the truth, it will shock you more than you ever thought possible. But today, her story is finally coming to light. And it's not what anyone expected. Emily's disappearance wasn't just any ordinary case. One moment, she was living her life like any other young woman, working a steady job, spending time with friends, making future plans. The next, she was gone. No signs, no clues, just an empty apartment and unanswered phone calls. It was as though she vanished into thin air. Her family and friends couldn't believe it. They searched high and low, called every contact they could think of. And yet, there was no trace of her. The police came in, conducted their investigation, but even they hit dead ends. Emily's case quickly turned cold. No one knew where she went or why she disappeared. Her life, once full of promise, became a mystery that no one could solve. But what the authorities and her loved ones didn't know was that Emily wasn't a random victim. Her captors had been watching her for a while. They knew everything about her, where she worked, who her friends were, what she liked to do in her spare time. They were patient, waiting for the perfect moment to take her. Emily was not chosen by accident. What had started as a routine morning, like any other, turned into a nightmare. Her captors struck when she least expected it, and Emily was swept away. They had a specific interest in her, something about. She made her an important target. Perhaps it was her family's wealth, her connections, or something more mysterious. But one thing was clear. She wasn't just a random girl taken for ransom or simple revenge. Emily had become a piece in someone else's game, a game that would keep her locked away for 10 long years. The more the authorities dug into Emily's life, the stranger the details became. There were unexplained phone calls, cryptic messages, and even rumors of powerful figures who had a vested interest in her. Yet, no one could figure out exactly what had happened to her or why she was targeted. The timeline of Emily's disappearance was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Her family couldn't rest, wondering why this had happened to her. Why Emily? What had she done to deserve this fate? As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to realize that she wasn't in just any ordinary prison. This wasn't a place designed to punish people for crimes. No, this was different. The walls, though cold and unwelcoming, had a strange purpose, one that Emily couldn't fully understand at first. Her captors were eerily calm, almost too calm. There was a routine to everything. They would come in, feed her, and check on her at specific times, always with the same expressionless faces. They never seemed angry, and strangely, they never spoke to her unless they had to. There was no sense of urgency, no rush. It was as if they were simply waiting for something. But waiting for what? Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just a prisoner. She was a part of something much bigger than herself. At first, she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, hoping that somehow someone would figure out where she was and rescued her. But as the days turned into months, Emily started to pay closer attention. She started noticing things, small things that didn't add up. The way her captors would sometimes exchange brief, cryptic glances, the whispers she overheard late at night. There were discussions that were hushed and half-heard conversations. Words like the project and the chosen one kept coming up in their talks, always spoken in such a way that it seemed like they were talking about her, but never directly. It didn't take long for Emily to realize that she wasn't simply in a prison. She was in a facility designed for something far darker. It was during one of these quiet moments when she overheard something that changed everything. "She's the one," a voice said, barely audible from behind the door. "The future. It's all part of the plan." Emily's heart raced as she tried to piece together the meaning of those words. What did they mean by the future? And why was she the one chosen? As Emily continued to listen, the pieces slowly started to fit together. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. She wasn't just some hostage being held for leverage or ransom. She was involved in something much more sinister, something she had no control over. The prison, the routine, the cryptic talks. It was all part of a larger plan, one that she was a part of whether she liked it or not. And that plan was much bigger than anything she could have imagined. Emily had spent years trapped in this eerie facility, and every day she grew more desperate to understand why she was there. The constant whispers, the cryptic conversations, it all pointed to something much bigger than she ever imagined. But now, she was finally starting to piece it all together. She had learned the truth. Emily wasn't just a victim in a random crime. She wasn't even just part of some strange experiment. No, the real reason she was chosen was far more disturbing and far-reaching than anyone could have predicted. She was the key, the center of a prophecy, a plan that involved her, one that could change everything. The strange conversations she had overheard, the mention of the project, and the chosen one, they all made sense now. Emily was the subject of an experiment, but not just any experiment. This was no ordinary scientific research or medical trial. She was part of something much darker. The people who had captured her and believed that she had unique abilities, something supernatural. They called it the power of the chosen. It was a force they believed could be harnessed, studied, and even used for control. The project, they claimed, had been set in motion long before she was born, and Emily had been chosen long ago to be the vessel for this strange and powerful force. But Emily hadn't just been a passive participant in their plans. She was beginning to fight back, her mind, sharper than ever as she understood the full extent of her importance. And in that moment, something shifted. She realized that if she could escape, she could bring down the whole system. She could stop whatever was happening before it spread further. But the stakes were higher now. Her escape wouldn't just mean freedom for her. It could mean the end of the plan they had built for years. It was during one of her nightly rounds, when the guards were distracted, that she heard the one thing that would change everything. Two of her captors, deep in conversation, revealed the cracks in their security. There was an opening, a moment of weakness. "They've all been warned," one said. "Just make sure the door stays locked tonight. We can't risk her escaping." That was it. That was the moment Emily had been waiting for. It was a sign that the plan was falling apart, that her captors were starting to panic. And she, Emily, the chosen one, had the chance to escape. Her heart raced as she quietly slid off the bed and moved toward the small, rusty window she had been eyeing for days. It was her only chance. Her body trembled with anticipation as she gathered the few items she had stashed away, some small tools she had managed to secretly collect over the years. This was it, the first real sign of hope in 10 years, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The clock was ticking. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she silently moved through the cold, dimly lit room. The air felt thick with tension. Each breath she took heavy with the weight of her decision. Tonight was the night. She could feel it in her bones. She had been waiting for this moment for years. And now, every second was critical. Every noise, no matter how small, made her flinch. The creak of the floorboard beneath her feet sent a shiver down her spine. The door to the hallway was only a few feet away, but it felt like a mile. She froze for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of footsteps. The guards were still on their rounds, and she had no idea how long this window of opportunity would last. It was now or never. Emily had been planning this escape for months, meticulously mapping out the guards' routines, the blind spots in their surveillance, and the tiny window of time she would have to slip through unnoticed. She had become an expert in quiet movements, learning how to move like a shadow, how to disappear into the silence of the night. But nothing could prepare her for the rush of fear and adrenaline that surged through her body now. Her hand gripped the cold doorknob, the faintest sound of metal scraping against metal making her freeze. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she held her breath, waiting for any sign that she had been heard. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, with a swift motion, she pushed the door open, just enough to slip through. The hallway stretched out in front of her, shrouded in darkness. Emily crept forward, her feet barely making a sound against the cold, concrete floor. Her eyes darted around, scanning for any movement, any shadow that might signal a guard's presence. The silence was deafening, but Emily's senses were razor-sharp. She had to focus. She couldn't afford any mistakes now. She turned a corner and froze. Two guards were talking just up ahead, their voices low and indistinct, but their figures unmistakable in the dim light. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself against the wall, holding as still as possible. She dared not even breathe. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest, each thud a loud reminder of how close she was to being caught. Time seemed to stretch on forever as she waited for the guards to move. The seconds felt like an eternity. When they finally turned away, Emily let out a silent breath of relief, but there was no time to waste. She continued her slow, deliberate movements, each step taking her closer to freedom. With every step, Emily's resolve grew stronger. The risk of being caught, the fear of failure, didn't matter anymore. She had come too far. She had endured too much. Nothing was going to stop her now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the end of the hallway and saw it, the exit, the door to the outside world, just beyond her reach. But as she made her way toward it, a sudden noise behind. She made her spin around. A guard. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. The guard was too close. She had no choice. She darted forward, adrenaline coursing through her veins. As she sprinted toward the exit, the door was almost there. One more step, and she could escape. She threw herself against the door, twisting the handle with all the force she could muster. The door creaked, open just enough for her to slip through. And then, for the first time in years, Emily was free. The outside world was a blur as she ran, the wind rushing past her, the sounds of the facility growing. Fainter and fainter. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't. There was no time. Her heart raced, her body pushed beyond its limits, but she didn't care. She was free. The years of isolation, the torment, the fear, it was all behind her now. But as she disappeared into the night, she couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? Was this the end of the story, or was there something even darker lurking out there, waiting for her? The night air was cold, but Emily barely felt it as she ran. Her mind was a blur of disbelief and confusion, each thought crashing into the next. The world she had known had just shattered into 1,000 pieces, and she was left to pick up the fragments. She had made it out of the secret facility, but what awaited her beyond its walls was something far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. It wasn't until she found herself hiding in an abandoned building, her heart still racing from the escape, that the truth started to dawn on her. The weight of it all hit her in waves as she began to piece together the details of the organization that had held her captive. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she had been part of something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. Her role in this twisted experiment, her place in their dark plans, it was all becoming clear. Emily hadn't been an accidental victim. She was the key. The project, the one that had been whispered about in hushed tones during her time in captivity, wasn't just some far-off idea. It was real, and she was at the center of it. The organization that had imprisoned her was no ordinary criminal group. It was an underground network, operating at the highest levels of power, with connections stretching far beyond anything Emily could have imagined. The more Emily thought back, the more she realized that she had been chosen for something far more sinister. She had been part of a genetic experiment, a project designed to unlock the secrets of human potential. The tests, the endless monitoring, the invasive procedures, they weren't just random acts of cruelty. They were all part of a calculated plan, a plan to experiment on human beings, to alter the course of science, politics, and maybe even the very fabric of society. Emily felt sick as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The chosen one they had talked about during her captivity. That was her. She was the one they had selected for their dangerous experiments. The thought of it made her stomach churn. She had been used as a lab rat, tested and manipulated by people who saw her as nothing more than a tool. But it didn't end there. As she gathered her thoughts, Emily began to uncover more. The documents she found during her escape, hidden papers in the facility, were damning. Each page she read revealed more about the twisted agenda that had been behind her captivity. They were planning something far-reaching. The experiments were just the beginning. There were whispers of a larger political agenda, a plan to use people like Emily to influence world events, to control governments, to alter the course of history. She had been a pawn in a much larger game. But what terrified her most was the realization that she wasn't the only one. She wasn't the first person. They had done this too. And she wouldn't be the last. The news outlets had started to catch wind of the scandal. Reports were circulating, piecing together fragments of the truth. Emily's story was starting to break through. Photos of her, the woman who had vanished without a trace for 10 years, were now splashed across every headline. People were finally starting to ask questions. Who had done this to her? Who was behind the project? The connections began to emerge. Hidden links between powerful figures, politicians, and business magnates. They were all tied to this secret organization. It wasn't just a few bad actors. This was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy, and it went all the way to the top. As Emily sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on her, she realized one thing. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her escape had exposed a dark and twisted world, a world filled with secrets that no one was supposed to know. But now the truth was coming out, and there was no going back. She had a choice now. She could keep running, hide from the truth, or she could fight. Emily wasn't sure she could trust anyone, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let the people who had used her for their experiments get away with it. She owed it to herself, and to the others like her, to expose the full scope of this nightmare. The question wasn't just how she had ended up in that hellhole for 10 years. It was how many others were still out there, suffering the same fate. Emily's story was only the beginning. The truth was unfolding, and there was no stopping it now. The darkness was coming to light, and the world would never be the same again. As Emily sat in the sterile, cold room, flipping through the confidential files in front of her, she could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. Every page she turned revealed the dark depths of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of society, implicating people she could never have imagined. But there was one thing that kept racing through her mind. Her escape had set the wheels in motion, and the world would never be the same. The authorities were working tirelessly, piecing together the details of the organization that had held Emily captive for so many years. Investigators were combing through every shred of evidence, every hidden file, trying to unravel the full scope of what had been going on behind closed doors. The more they uncovered, the more horrifying it became. Emily's escape had exposed a truth that no one was prepared for. This wasn't just about her. This was a sprawling, insidious network that had affected countless innocent lives. People had been experimented on, used as pawns in a twisted game that was far bigger than anyone had realized. Now, the investigation was no longer just about finding out what happened to Emily. It was about bringing an end to the conspiracy that had been operating in the shadows for decades. But for Emily, the toll of what had happened was just beginning to set in. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still hear the faint echoes of the whispers from the dark corridors. Every noise made her jump. Every shadow seemed to be following her. The psychological scars from her captivity were deep, and though she was physically free, her mind was still trapped in that hellhole. She knew the danger wasn't over. The organization that had held her captive was still out there, and they would stop at nothing to silence her. Emily had seen firsthand how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets, and she knew she couldn't let her guard down. They had eyes everywhere, and now that she was on the outside, they would do everything they could to finish what they started. As she sat there with the investigators, Emily glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone. Lurking in the shadows, the fear never quite left her, and with good reason. The organization's reach was vast, and the fact that she had escaped meant they would likely come after her, determined to prevent her from exposing the truth. Slowly, Emily began to recover, but the path to healing was long and uncertain. She no longer had the luxury of being a carefree woman with a normal life. The horrors she had experienced would stay with her forever, like an invisible scar that no amount of time could erase. But even in the midst of her trauma, there was a sense of resolve. She had survived. She had escaped. And now, she was determined to see this through to the end. The ongoing investigation into the secret organization was slowly gaining momentum. The authorities had their hands full, but they were committed to finding every person involved, bringing them to justice, and putting an end to the monstrous project that had controlled Emily's life for so long. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Even with the conspiracy beginning to unravel, she knew that there were others out there who had been through what she went through. Others who were still being held, trapped in the shadows of the world. It wasn't just her story. It was the story of everyone who had suffered at the hands of this twisted organization. The future was uncertain, but Emily was no longer a passive victim. She was now a survivor, and she was determined to use what she knew to make sure no one else would have to endure the same fate. The investigation might have just begun, but Emily's fight was far from over. There were still secrets to uncover and more lives to save. She would be there every step of the way, even if it meant facing down the very people who had nearly broken her. Now that you've heard Emily's story, we want to know, what would you do if you were in her shoes? Would you fight back, or would you run? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can stay updated on more incredible stories like this one.